They say some things only come when the world is asleep, when the streets are empty, the air too still, and the clock hits a strange hour. Some things you're not supposed to see, and if you do see them, you're not supposed to go near them. Evan Miller was not a man who invited trouble into his life. He kept things simple. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, and repeat. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his, and it was predictable. After all, Evan had had enough chaos to last a lifetime. If you enjoy unsettling stories that stay with you long after they're over, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Now let's begin. At 26 years old, Evan was a quiet observer of the world, a man who could disappear in a crowd without ever being missed. He wasn't particularly tall or short, handsome or ugly. His dark hair was cut short, always neat, and his wardrobe consisted of unremarkable jeans, t-shirts, and sneakers. He didn't like to stand out. Evan lived in a rented house on the edge of a small, unremarkable town, a place where neighbors only nodded at each other in passing, and the streets emptied well before midnight. It wasn't where he wanted to be. But after his last relationship ended in a spectacular crash, leaving him with nothing but debt and a permanent grimace, Evan didn't have much of a choice. This house was cheap, quiet. It was also lonely. Evan spent his days working remotely as a freelance proofreader, combing through manuscripts for grammar mistakes while listening to the dull hum of his space heater. He liked the job for the same reason he hated it. It didn't require him to talk to anyone. After his work hours were done, Evan would microwave a frozen meal, crack open a beer, and scroll endlessly on his phone until his eyes burned. Sleep rarely came easily, but Evan had made his peace with it. That's how it had been for months. Routine, bland, and empty. He told himself it was better that way. Then, on a Wednesday night, the bus appeared. It had been raining hard, the kind of rain that drums against the roof like impatient fingertips. Evan sat by his window, nursing his third beer of the night, while his laptop hummed softly on the table behind him. The rain blurred the glass, and the street outside had turned into a rippling pool of black water. He glanced at the clock. 2:21 a.m. Evan frowned. It was late, even for him. Most nights, the neighborhood fell silent long before midnight. There were no kids sneaking out, no cars driving by, just stillness. But tonight felt different. The air was thick and heavy, and something about the rain sounded off. It took him a moment to notice the faint hum. It wasn't coming from inside the house. No, it was coming from outside. Evan leaned closer to the window, wiping away the condensation with his sleeve. That's when he saw it. A bus, parked at the curb directly in front of his house, its headlights casting weak beams onto the wet pavement. Evan squinted. The bus was old, its paint chipped and faded. It was red, a deep, muddy red, the kind that looked dull even under the glow of a street lamp. There was no logo on its side, no indication of where it might be from or where it was headed, just a number painted crookedly on the front, 22. The strangest part, though, was how quiet it was. The engine was running. He could feel it humming faintly in the air, but there was no sound, no idle growl, no hiss of brakes, just silence. Evan's first thought was that maybe a driver had gotten lost. It was a small town, after all. Things like that happened. He waited for someone to step off the bus, for the doors to creak open, but nothing happened. The bus just sat there. Minutes passed. Evan frowned. The longer he stared at it, the more wrong it seemed. The rain distorted his view, but he thought he could see something, or someone inside. Shadows. Figures sitting perfectly still, their heads lowered, like they were asleep or waiting for something. He shivered, the chill crawling up his spine. "This is stupid," he muttered, turning away from the window. It wasn't his problem. Whatever it was, it didn't concern him. But as he sat back down at his desk, he couldn't focus. The hum of the bus had burrowed into his head, filling the room like an invisible pressure. He glanced at the window again. It was still there. 2:22. Evan blinked. The clock had changed, and for some reason, it sent a spike of unease through him. He stared at the bus, half expecting something to happen. But the rain just kept falling, and the bus just kept waiting. After another minute, Evan grabbed the blinds and yanked them shut. Out of sight, out of mind. He didn't have time for whatever weirdness was happening outside. With a sigh, he picked up his phone and started scrolling, trying to distract himself. It didn't work. The hum was still there. When Evan woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the blinds, and the rain had stopped. He sat up groggily, his neck stiff from sleeping at his desk. For a moment, he almost convinced himself he'd dreamed it all. The bus, the hum, the strange unease. But when he pulled the blinds back, his stomach dropped. The street outside was empty now, but there were tire marks on the wet pavement. Long, deep grooves where something heavy had been parked overnight. Evan stared at them, the back of his neck prickling. "Probably just a maintenance bus or something," he said aloud, though the words felt hollow. As the day wore on, he pushed the memory aside. He convinced himself it wasn't worth thinking about. Things like that didn't happen to people like him. People who lived quiet, boring lives. He went through his work, microwaved his dinner, and sat back down at the same spot by the window. But when the clock struck 2:22 a.m. that night, the bus was there again. Evan squinted. The bus was old, its paint chipped and faded. It was red, a deep, muddy red, the kind that looked dull even under the glow of a street lamp. There was no logo on its side, no indication of where it might be from or where it was headed, just a number painted crookedly on the front, 22. The strangest part, though, was how quiet it was. The engine was running. He could feel it humming faintly in the air, but there was no sound, no idle growl, no hiss of brakes, just silence. Evan's first thought was that maybe a driver had gotten lost. It was a small town, after all. Things like that happened. He waited for someone to step off the bus, for the doors to creak open, but nothing happened. The bus just sat there. Minutes passed. Evan frowned. The longer he stared at it, the more wrong it seemed. The rain distorted his view, but he thought he could see something, or someone inside. Shadows. Figures sitting perfectly still, their heads lowered, like they were asleep or waiting for something. He shivered, the chill crawling up his spine. "This is stupid," he muttered, turning away from the window. It wasn't his problem. Whatever it was, it didn't concern him. But as he sat back down at his desk, he couldn't focus. The hum of the bus had burrowed into his head, filling the room like an invisible pressure. He glanced at the window again. It was still there. 2:22. Evan blinked. The clock had changed, and for some reason, it sent a spike of unease through him. He stared at the bus, half expecting something to happen. But the rain just kept falling, and the bus just kept waiting. After another minute, Evan grabbed the blinds and yanked them shut. Out of sight, out of mind. He didn't have time for whatever weirdness was happening outside. With a sigh, he picked up his phone and started scrolling, trying to distract himself. It didn't work. The hum was still there. When Evan woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the blinds, and the rain had stopped. He sat up groggily, his neck stiff from sleeping at his desk. For a moment, he almost convinced himself he'd dreamed it all. The bus, the hum, the strange unease. But when he pulled the blinds back, his stomach dropped. The street outside was empty now, but there were tire marks on the wet pavement. Long, deep grooves where something heavy had been parked overnight. Evan stared at them, the back of his neck prickling. "Probably just a maintenance bus or something," he said aloud, though the words felt hollow. As the day wore on, he pushed the memory aside. He convinced himself it wasn't worth thinking about. Things like that didn't happen to people like him. People who lived quiet, boring lives. He went through his work, microwaved his dinner, and sat back down at the same spot by the window. But when the clock struck 2:22 a.m. that night, the bus was there again. This time, Evan was ready. He didn't approach the window right away. Instead, he sat stiffly at his desk, his heart hammering as he listened for the hum. It was there, soft, low like a faraway generator. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. The bus hadn't moved. It sat in the exact same spot as the night before, its headlights dim and flickering. Evan swallowed hard, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. He couldn't see anyone inside this time, but that only made it worse. Why was it there? Evan's chest tightened as he realized something. The bus was parked outside his house. Not a neighbor's, not across the street. His. He stood up, his knees trembling slightly, and stepped toward the window. His breath fogged up the glass as he stared. For the first time, a thought crept into his mind. One he couldn't shake. It's waiting for me. A sharp knock on the front door made Evan jump so hard he nearly fell over. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. He spun around, staring at the door. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. Evan's pulse roared in his ears. He glanced back at the window. The bus was still there, motionless, but something felt different now. Wrong. For a long moment, Evan didn't move. He just stood there, his breath shallow, listening to the silence. Finally, he stepped toward the door, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. His hand trembled as he gripped the knob. Slowly, he turned it and opened the door a crack. There was no one there, but on the doorstep, lying in a small puddle of rainwater, was a single folded note. Evan stared at it, his mouth dry. He bent down, his fingers shaking as he picked it up and unfolded the damp paper. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic. The message was short. If there is a red bus outside your house at 2:22 a.m., don't get on it. Evan's hands went cold. He looked back up at the empty street. The bus was still there, silent and waiting. And for the first time in years, Evan realized he was no longer alone. Evan stared at the note in his trembling hands. If there is a red bus outside your house at 2:22 a.m., don't get on it. The words felt like a punch to the gut, even though they didn't make sense. What was this? A joke? A prank by some kid in the neighborhood? But there was something about the handwriting, uneven and jittery, as if whoever wrote it had been afraid. He glanced back at the bus. It was still there, parked perfectly in front of his house, its dim headlights casting weak pools of light onto the wet pavement. Evan could feel its presence pressing on him now, like a weight on his chest. The hum, the soft, constant vibration of the engine, wormed its way into his ears and refused to leave. He looked up and down the street. It was empty. No other lights and houses, no cars passing by, not even a dog barking in the distance. Just the bus and him. Evan stepped back inside, his hand still clutching the note, and closed the door softly. He locked it, throwing the deadbolt for good measure. Then, because his mind wouldn't stop racing, he paced the living room, glancing at the clock on the wall. 2:24 a.m. The minutes crawled by slowly, painfully. Evan sat on the couch, the note beside him, and stared at the door as though expecting someone, or something, to knock again. But nothing happened. By the time the first hints of dawn bled through the blinds, the bus was gone. The next day passed in a haze. Evan barely touched his work, barely ate. The words on the note echoed in his head like a bad song on repeat. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just some weirdo having a laugh at his expense. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. The chipped red paint, the shadowy figures inside, the way the bus sat there like it belonged outside his house. By nightfall, the air inside his house felt thick and suffocating. Evan left all the lights on, but it didn't help. He kept checking his phone, watching the hours tick by. Midnight, 1 o'clock. The later it got, the harder his pulse pounded in his ears. When the clock struck 2:20 a.m., he stood by the window, clutching the blinds in his sweaty hand. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. At 2:22 a.m., the bus appeared. It slid silently into place as though it had always been there, its headlights flickering faintly in the dark. Evan watched it for what felt like forever. He expected the door to open, or someone to step off, or something to happen. But the bus just sat there, waiting. He could feel it this time, the pull. An urge that settled deep in his chest. Go to it. The thought didn't feel like his own. It was quiet but insistent, like a whisper threading through the back of his mind. Evan shook his head, trying to dismiss it, but the feeling didn't go away. Before he knew it, he was standing by the front door, hand on the knob. His heart raced. He remembered the note, remembered the warning, but some part of him, some foolish, desperate part, needed to see, needed to know. The night air hit him like a slap when he stepped outside. It was colder than he expected, the rain from the previous nights lingering in the air. Evan stood on the porch, staring at the bus. The door was open. It hadn't made a sound, and Evan didn't know when it had happened, but there it was, yawning open like a black mouth. The interior was dark, impossibly so, as though the light from the street lamp couldn't reach inside. He hesitated. A voice screamed in his head to go back inside, to lock the door, to forget any of this ever happened. But his feet moved anyway, carrying him down the steps, across the street, and up to the open door. The hum of the engine grew louder. It vibrated in his bones now, rattling through him like the distant echo of thunder. Evan peered inside. Hello? Silence. The seats were lined in rows, old and torn, with bits of stuffing spilling out in places. The aisle stretched back farther than it should have, as though the bus was longer on the inside than it looked from the outside. He squinted, trying to see if anyone was there, and froze. There were figures in the seats, dozens of them. They sat perfectly still, heads lowered, hands resting in their laps. Their clothes were outdated, old suits, long dresses, moth-eaten and gray. He couldn't see their faces, and he didn't want to. His stomach twisted. Every instinct told him to turn around and run. But before he could, a voice spoke. "Where to?" The voice came from the driver's seat at the front of the bus. Evan's head snapped toward it, his breath catching. The driver sat hunched over the wheel, his hands gripping it tightly. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a hat, and his uniform looked like something from a bygone era, faded and worn. "What?" Evan stammered. The driver's head tilted slightly, though his face remained hidden. "Where to?" he repeated, his voice low and rasping, like the scrape of sandpaper. Evan took a step back. I think I made a mistake." The driver didn't move. Then, slowly, the door creaked shut behind him. Evan spun around, grabbing for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him. "Hey, let me out!" The driver said nothing. The hum of the engine grew louder, deeper, until it rattled the floor beneath Evan's feet. The bus began to move. "No, no, no! Stop!" Evan shouted, slamming his fists against the door. But the bus didn't stop. Outside, the street blurred past, the houses and street lamps smearing together into streaks of black and gray. Evan turned back toward the aisle. The figures in the seats hadn't moved, but now they seemed closer, their bodies slightly turned toward him. He could feel their attention, though their heads remained lowered, as if they were watching him without eyes. His chest heaved as he stumbled backward, his mind screaming for a way out. "Where are you taking me?" he shouted at the driver. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. "You got on." "What? You got on?" the driver repeated, his voice a low growl. "You chose to ride." Evan shook his head violently. "I didn't choose anything. You stopped outside my house. I didn't ask for this." The driver didn't answer. The bus rattled and groaned as it picked up speed. The world outside nothing but a dark blur now. It didn't look like his neighborhood anymore. It didn't even look like a real place. The buildings had twisted into impossible shapes, stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The street had turned black, a void stretching endlessly in every direction. The hum in the air turned into a deafening roar. Evan clutched his head, stumbling down the aisle. The figures in the seats seemed to lean toward him now, their hands twitching in their laps. He could hear them whispering, soft, rasping murmurs that made his skin crawl. His name. They were whispering his name. "Evan, Evan, Evan." He clamped his hands over his ears, his breath ragged. "Stop it, just stop it." The whispers grew louder. The bus jolted violently, throwing Evan to the floor. He landed hard, his head striking the metal edge of a seat. Pain exploded behind his eyes as he scrambled to his feet, his vision swimming. "Let me off," he screamed at the driver, tears streaming down his face. The driver's head tilted up slightly, and for the first time, Evan saw what was beneath the hat. It was a face, but it wasn't human. The skin was stretched too tight, the eyes sunken and hollow, glowing faintly red in the darkness. The mouth twisted into a grin far too wide. "End of the line," the driver rasped. The bus shuddered to a stop. Evan stumbled back as the figures in the seats began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. They turned toward him, their faces still hidden, and began to move down the aisle. Evan's blood ran cold. The door was still closed. He was trapped. The last thing he heard was the hiss of the brakes and the hum of the engine as the figures reached for him. Evan didn't remember falling. He didn't remember the cold hands that had grabbed at him or the darkness that had swallowed him whole. What he remembered was waking up. He opened his eyes to total silence. The first thing he felt was the floor beneath him. Hard, cold, and damp. It wasn't the sticky, grime-covered aisle of the bus anymore. It felt more like stone. He blinked, his vision blurry, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The bus was gone. He was lying in a narrow corridor, the walls towering high above him on either side. They weren't made of brick or concrete. No, these walls were wrong. They seemed organic, like petrified wood that had twisted and fused together in unnatural shapes. Roots, black and gnarled, slithered from the walls, curling along the floor like veins. The air was suffocating, thick and heavy with a smell that made Evan gag. It was metallic, like rusted iron or old blood. He pushed himself up on shaking arms, wincing as pain lanced through his skull. When he touched the back of his head, his hand came away sticky with blood. Where am I? His voice came out cracked and hoarse, swallowed by the oppressive silence. There was no answer. Evan staggered to his feet, his breathing shallow and uneven. The corridor stretched in two directions, both paths fading into shadow. It didn't matter which way he went. They both looked the same. You got on? The driver's voice echoed in his memory, making his stomach churn. Evan tried to push the words away, to focus on surviving. Get out, he thought. Find a way out. He picked a direction and began walking. The corridor seemed endless. Every few feet, Evan passed doorways set into the walls. Massive, arched doors made of black wood, their surfaces covered in strange carvings that hurt his eyes when he looked at them too closely. They didn't have handles or hinges. They just were, like they'd grown out of the walls themselves. The farther he walked, the worse the air became. It was colder now, the chills sinking into his skin and settling in his bones. He hugged himself, teeth chattering, trying to ignore the way his footsteps echoed back at him. Something felt off about the sound, though. After a while, Evan realized the echoes weren't matching his steps perfectly. He stopped. The echoes stopped a second after he did. Evan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned slowly, peering back down the corridor. It was empty, just as it had been before. But the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone. The silence pressed down harder now, thick and waiting. He took a step back, then another, his heart hammering. From somewhere deep in the corridor, he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Footsteps. Hello? He called out, though his voice cracked with fear. Who's there? No response. The footsteps continued, soft, deliberate, drawing closer. Evan turned and ran. The corridor twisted and branched like a maze, but no matter how many turns Evan took, the sound of the footsteps followed. He sprinted, lungs burning, feet pounding against the stone floor. He could hear it behind him now, faster, heavier. He didn't dare look back. Suddenly, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. Evan skidded to a halt, nearly collapsing as he struggled to catch his breath. The room was enormous, so large he couldn't see the walls or ceiling, as though the space stretched on forever. In the center of the room stood a single bus stop. It was absurd, just a bench, a metal pole, and a small sign that read "End of the line." The bench looked ancient, its wood cracked and splintered. The pole leaned slightly to one side, rusted through. The light above the sign flickered weakly, casting a pale glow onto the ground below. Evan turned back to the corridor he'd come from. It was empty. The footsteps had stopped. He swallowed hard, his gaze returning to the bus stop. Something about it made his skin crawl, but there was nowhere else to go. Slowly, cautiously, he approached. The light flickered again. As he neared the bench, he noticed someone sitting there. It was a woman. She was slumped over, her long hair hanging in front of her face like a curtain. Her clothes were old, ripped, stained, and decades out of style. Her hands rested limply in her lap, her posture unnaturally still. Evan stopped a few feet away, his throat dry. Hello? The woman didn't move. He took a hesitant step closer. Are you okay? The woman's head twitched. Slowly, her face lifted. Evan's breath caught in his chest. Her face was wrong. The skin was pale and stretched, her features twisted as though someone had tried to rearrange them. Her mouth was too wide, curling up into a grotesque smile that split her cheeks. Her eyes were empty, black voids that reflected nothing. She whispered something, her voice low and wet. What? Evan croaked, stepping back. Her lips moved again, her grin widening. You got on? Evan staggered back, his pulse thundering in his ears. What do you mean? What do you want from me? The woman's grin twitched as her head tilted sharply to the side, the sound of cracking bone filling the silence. She raised a hand, her bony finger pointing behind him. Evan froze. A low hum vibrated through the air, the sound of an engine. Slowly, he turned around. The bus was there. It wasn't parked in front of his house this time. It was here, inside the chamber, its faded red paint glistening like fresh blood under the flickering light. Its headlights flared to life, blinding him for a moment before dimming to an unsettling glow. The door opened with a hiss. No, Evan whispered. No, I'm not getting back on. The woman behind him began to laugh. A dry, rattling sound that grew louder and louder until it echoed through the cavernous space. Evan clamped his hands over his ears, stumbling backward, but the laughter only grew. The figures from the bus began to emerge. One by one, they stepped off, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were hidden, their heads bowed, but Evan could feel their gaze on him. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They spilled out of the bus, forming a circle around him. He turned in every direction, his panic surging as the figures drew closer. "I didn't choose this," he screamed. "I didn't ask for this." The driver stepped off the bus last, his hat still obscuring most of his face, his mouth curled into that inhuman grin. "You got on," the driver said again, his voice low and final. The figures moved as one, closing the circle. Their hands reached for Evan, cold, skeletal fingers grabbing his arms, his legs, his neck. He screamed, thrashing against them, but their grip was unrelenting. The last thing he saw was the bus. Its headlights flared brighter, swallowing everything in blinding light, and then there was nothing. Evan awoke to the sound of an engine. He sat upright, gasping for air. He was on the bus again, slumped in one of the torn seats. Outside, the world was dark and empty, the windows fogged and streaked with grime. The bus was still moving. Evan looked around, his heart racing. The figures were back in their seats, motionless. The driver sat at the wheel, hands gripping it tightly, his head tilted slightly as though he were smiling. The engine's hum filled the silence. Evan turned toward the window, wiping away a patch of grime to see outside. There was nothing out there, just blackness stretching forever, as if the bus were moving through a void. He slumped back in his seat, tears welling in his eyes. There was no way off, no escape. The bus kept driving, its engine humming, as the sign above the driver flickered to life. "Next stop, you got on." Evan let out a quiet sob as the hum swallowed everything and the bus drove on into eternity. If you enjoyed this chilling ride into the unknown, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. And remember, if you ever see a red bus outside your house at 2:22 a.m., don't get on. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.